Resident Evil has spent nearly 3 decades building some of gaming's most iconic monsters, but the series quietly pulled off something way more impressive than any jump scare. It learned how to make you feel guilty for killing them. Today, I'm breaking down the most tragic monster backstories in the entire franchise, and every single one of them will make you rethink what a villain actually is, starting with the one that proved it was possible in the first place, Lisa Trevor. Lisa Trevor was 14 years old when Umbrella started injecting her with experimental viruses. 14. She wasn't a soldier, she wasn't a scientist, she wasn't some willing volunteer who signed a waiver. She was a kid, and they turned her into a test subject that would endure repeated injections across the span of over 30 years. Here's the thing about Lisa that separates her from almost every other creature in the franchise. She survived everything, every single injection. Her body didn't just resist the viruses, it autonomously regenerated and absorbed viral samples from other BOW specimens like some kind of biological sponge. Umbrella kept pumping new strains into her because nothing worked the way they expected, and instead of dying, she just kept mutating, which is, you know, not ideal. But the worst part isn't what happened to her body, it's what happened to her mind. Lisa's consciousness persisted through the entire transformation. She retained fragmented memories, emotional responses. She remembered things. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. Enough to know something was wrong. Enough to feel pain that wasn't just physical. She spent decades imprisoned in the training facility beneath the Spencer mansion, fully aware that she was becoming something inhuman and completely powerless to stop it. Her face was permanently destroyed by the scarring from procedures. The thing you encounter in the game barely resembles a person anymore, but that's exactly the point. Lisa didn't become a monster. She was turned into one. Slowly, over 3 decades, while she was still in there, watching it happen. And that's what makes her the thesis statement for this entire video. Resident Evil's scariest trick was never the jump scares. It was making you realize the thing you just killed used to be a person. Lisa Trevor proved the franchise could do that, and she proved it first. But if Lisa's story makes you uncomfortable, wait until you hear about the Umbrella scientist who injected himself with his own creation to avoid getting murdered. Spoiler, it didn't go well for anyone involved. William Birkin. William Birkin is the guy who literally created the thing that destroyed him. And honestly, it's hard to know whether to feel sorry for him or not. Here's the thing. Birkin wasn't some low-level Umbrella grunt who stumbled into something he didn't understand. He was a Tier 1 scientist, top of the food chain. The man created the G-Virus, one of the most aggressive mutagenic agents in the entire franchise. And he did it knowingly. He spent years developing bioweapons for a corporation he knew was evil. It's not a guy who deserves a sympathy card. But then, September 22nd, 1998 happened. Umbrella sent their own security team to take Birkin out and steal the G-Virus. They shot him multiple times, left him bleeding out on the floor of his own lab. The corporation he'd given his career to decided he was a loose end. So Birkin, dying on the ground with a syringe of his own creation within arm's reach, did the only thing he could think of. He injected himself with the G-Virus. Not because he wanted power, not because he had some grand plan, because he was a dying man who didn't want to die. And then things got significantly worse. The G-Virus forced his body through 5 distinct mutation stages, each one less human than the last. G1 still had a vaguely human silhouette. By G5, Birkin was a mass of teeth and tissue that barely resembled anything biological, let alone a person. Every stage stripped away more of whatever was left inside, but here's where it gets complicated. His daughter Sherry was still in Raccoon City during all of this, and despite being her father, the G-Virus didn't leave any room for parental instinct. Birkin didn't protect Sherry. He implanted her with a G-embryo. His own daughter became a host for the very organism he'd engineered. The man who made the virus used his child to spread it. Whatever was left of William Birkin by that point wasn't making decisions anymore. And the cruel part? The only reason Sherry survived was because a vaccine called Devil existed to counteract the embryo's growth. So the thing that almost killed his daughter and the science that saved her both trace back to the same Umbrella research her father dedicated his life to. That's the whole tragedy of William Birkin in one sentence. He created the monster, became the monster, and the only person he should have protected nearly died because of the monster. But if you think one man's downward spiral is dark, wait until you hear about the Ashford twins. Because generational Umbrella trauma hits different when it starts in childhood. The Ashford twins. Most Resident Evil villains chose their path. They signed up for Umbrella, they ran the experiments, they got what was coming to them. Alfred and Alexia Ashford were children. They inherited an entire Antarctic research facility as part of Umbrella's founding bloodline, and neither of them had any say in the matter. They were born into an empire of cruelty and handed the keys before they understood by what the locks were holding back. And that's where the tragedy starts, but it's not where it ends. Alexia was a prodigy, terrifyingly intelligent, obsessed with the T. Veronica virus, and absolutely certain she could perfect what every other Umbrella scientist had failed to do. So in 1983, at the age of 12, she placed herself into cryogenic suspension as a self-imposed test subject. Most kids that age are figuring out how to talk to their crush. Alexia was freezing herself alive to incubate a bioweapon inside her own body. She planned to sleep for 15 years while the virus integrated with her cells. That left Alfred completely alone. No parents, no sister, no oversight, just a kid rattling around in an Arctic base full of biological horrors with zero human connection. Over the next 15 years, Alfred's mind collapsed. He developed a dissociative disorder so severe he began impersonating Alexia, dressing as her, speaking as her, splitting himself into two people because the loneliness of being one was unbearable, which is, not ideal. But here's where it gets genuinely devastating. When Alexia finally woke up during code, Veronica, she was biologically still 12, frozen in time. Her brother had aged 15 years into a fractured, delusional shell. Alfred couldn't recognize his real sister because he'd spent over a decade becoming her, and Alexia couldn't recognize her brother because the person standing in front of her wasn't the boy she remembered. It was a stranger wearing her face. Neither twin saw a human being when they looked at the other, just a reflection of what Umbrella had taken from them. Fans rightly point out the Ashfords were victims of generational exploitation. They didn't build Umbrella's machine, they were fed into it. But Alexia complicates that sympathy because when she woke up, she didn't try to escape. She continued the weaponization experiments. She embraced the monster. Whether that was the virus talking or a conscious choice is something code. Veronica never fully answers, and that ambiguity makes it worse. You want to feel sorry for her. The game makes it really hard to do that cleanly. The Ashfords are gothic horror at its finest. Two children, one frozen and one falling apart, trapped in the same building for 15 years. And when they finally reunite, there's nothing left to save. But if you think a ruined sibling bond is the saddest thing code Veronica has to offer, wait until you hear what happened to Steve Burnside. Steve Burnside. No warning, no countdown, no chance at a cure. Steve Burnside went from a scared teenager to an irreversible monster in what felt like minutes. One injection of the Veronica virus and that was it. Steve was 17 years old when everything went sideways. He'd been imprisoned on Rockford Island alongside his father, locked up by Umbrella for reasons the game barely bothers to explain. His dad had tried to sell company secrets, and Umbrella's idea of a proportional response was throwing the whole family in a detention facility on a remote island. By the time the outbreak hit Rockford, Steve had already lost any semblance of a normal life. He was already broken before the monsters even showed up. And honestly, Steve wasn't the most likable guy at first. He was loud, impulsive, kind of annoying. The type of character you'd expect to get himself killed doing something stupid within the first hour. He had this rough, abrasive energy that made it easy to write him off as just another scared kid with a bad attitude, which is exactly what makes his death hit so hard. Steve didn't get infected during the chaos of Rockford Island. He made it out. He survived. And then Alexia Ashford injected him with the Veronica virus at the Antarctic base, because apparently, escaping one nightmare just earns you a ticket to a worse one. His body mutated rapidly, transforming him into something massive and violent, a creature that attacked the one person he'd spent the entire game trying to protect. But here's where it gets complicated. Steve didn't fully turn. He fought it. A 17-year-old kid, his body literally tearing itself apart at the cellular level, and he refused to let go. His final act was protecting Claire Redfield, slashing through the tentacles that had her pinned, cutting her free, and holding on to just enough of himself to recognize her face one last time. Then he died in her arms. Not a monster, not some unrecognizable creature. A boy who knew her name and couldn't stop what was happening to him. Players have called it the most emotional death in the entire franchise, and honestly, it's hard to argue. There's something uniquely devastating about a kid who lost his family, got dragged to the other side of the world as a prisoner, finally found someone worth fighting for, and had his body stolen from him before he could even say goodbye properly. Say a wish. Steve Burnside's entire redemption arc fits inside a single game. A single day, really. And that's the tragedy. He didn't get enough time to be the person he was becoming. But if Steve's transformation was fast, the next monster on this list had decades to watch himself unravel. Morpheus D. Duval. Nobody remembers this guy, and honestly, might be the saddest part of his entire story. Morpheus D. Duval was a former Umbrella R&D employee who got thrown under the bus after the 1998 Arclay incident. The Mansion disaster needed a scapegoat, and Umbrella picked Morpheus. Didn't matter how long he'd worked for them or what he'd contributed. When the company needed someone to blame, he was the name on the chopping block. And before you start thinking, well, he was Umbrella, he deserved whatever happened to him, hear me out. Because it's more complicated than that. After getting discarded by the corporation he'd given his career to. Duvall didn't crawl into a hole and disappear. He stole a sample of the T-virus and hijacked the Spencer Rain, a luxury cruise liner, holding it hostage with the threat of unleashing a bioweapon on the world. This wasn't a desperate man lashing out randomly. This was a calculated revenge plot against the company that ruined him. He wanted Umbrella to burn, and he was willing to take a ship full of people down with him to make it happen. But here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. When things started falling apart on the Spencer Rain, Duvall didn't go down fighting like a normal person. He injected himself with the T+G virus, voluntarily, willingly shoved a needle into his own body and triggered a transformation into a tyrant-like creature with electrical abilities. This wasn't some accident. This wasn't a containment breach catching him off guard. He chose this. He looked at what Umbrella's viruses did to people and said, yeah, give me that. And yeah, the you reap what you sow argument is right there. He spent his career working for a corporation that turned people into monsters, got chewed up and spit out by that same corporation, and then voluntarily turned himself into the exact kind of weapon they'd been building. But poetic symmetry doesn't make it less horrifying. Being betrayed doesn't justify becoming the monster, and becoming the monster doesn't erase the betrayal. It just makes the whole thing lonelier, because nobody's coming to save the guy who willingly became the weapon that's now consuming him. The community is pretty split on Duvall. Some people see an Umbrella stooge who got what was coming to him. Others see a man discarded by a soulless corporation who snapped and became the exact thing his employers spent decades manufacturing. Both readings are correct. That's what makes him tragic. The fact that most Resident Evil fans couldn't pick Morpheus D. Duvall out of a lineup tells you everything. Not every monster gets a wiki page with 10,000 words and a fan art tag. Some of them just get forgotten, which, if you think about it, is exactly what Umbrella would have wanted. But if Duvall's story is about a man who chose to become his own creation, the next entry is about a girl who never had a choice in the first place, Manuela Hidalgo. Most Resident Evil victims become monsters. Manuela Hidalgo became a container. That distinction matters because it changes the entire nature of her tragedy. She wasn't mutated into something unrecognizable. She wasn't turned into a weapon that could fight back. She was kept human enough to serve a purpose, and that purpose was to keep a virus alive inside her own body. Here's the setup. Manuela was the daughter of South American crime lord Javier Hidalgo. When she was a child, she contracted the same disease that killed her mother. Javier's solution was not, as you might hope, conventional medicine. His solution was the T. Veronica virus. He injected his own daughter with it, believing it could save her life. And technically, it did. But the virus needed constant management, which meant Manuela required repeated organ transplants from other young girls just to keep the T. Veronica effects from consuming her entirely. She was a biological maintenance project. That's it. That was her entire value to her father's operation. Not as a daughter, not as a person, just a warm body to keep stable long enough for the virus to remain controlled. For years she lived this way while the T. Veronica virus simmered inside her. During that time, her body carried the constant threat of mutation, partial transformations that could surface if the delicate balance ever tipped. She could feel it lurking. She was aware the entire time, which is, you know, not ideal. But here's where Manuela's story separates from every other T. Veronica host in the franchise. She survived. During Operation Javier in 2002, Leon Kennedy and Jack Krauser were sent in and extracted her from her father's compound. She lived through the entire ordeal, was taken into U.S. government custody, and remained alive. Permanent scarring, severe psychological trauma, but breathing. One of the only known humans to carry T. Veronica and not lose herself completely to it. That sounds like a happy ending until you realize the conditions of her survival. Manuela didn't save herself. She didn't fight her way out. She didn't develop some resistance. Leon and Krauser intervened, and that intervention is the sole reason Manuela drew breath after 2002. Her survival was entirely contingent on someone else deciding she was worth saving. Zero agency from start to finish, and the franchise just moved on. Manuela gets brief mentions in supplemental materials, a footnote in the broader for years and came out the other side, and Capcom treated her like a side quest. The community has been frustrated about this for years, and honestly, they're right. Manuela's story deserved continuation. It deserved weight. Instead, she got a couple of files and silence. People ask whether surviving makes you less tragic. It doesn't. Not when your survival was someone else's choice and your body was someone else's tool. But if Manuela's story bothers you because of how her body was used as a vessel, wait until you meet the little girl who was literally built to be one, Eveline. Every other entry on this list follows the same formula. Human becomes monster. Person loses themselves to a virus, a parasite, a corporation that saw them as expendable. Eveline flips that completely. She was never human. She was built from the ground up to be a weapon, and all she wanted was to be someone's daughter. The connections created her around 2014 as a next-generation bioweapon. Not a virus, not a parasite in the traditional sense. Eveline was designed to spread infection through organic mold, a living delivery system that could regenerate tissue, absorb organic matter, and create constructs out of nothing. She was biologically 12 years old, with an artificially accelerated lifespan capped at roughly 30 years. A disposable child with an expiration date, which is, not ideal. But here's where it gets complicated. Eveline developed sentience, real, genuine emotional awareness. She didn't want to infect people. She wanted a family. When she encountered the Bakers in 2017, she latched onto them with the desperate affection of a kid who'd never been loved by anyone. She called Marguerite Mommy. She wanted Jack to be her father. She wanted to belong somewhere. The problem is that her biology only knew one way to express love: infection. The mold spread through the Baker household not because Eveline was being malicious, but because connection and contamination were literally the same thing for her. Every hug was an exposure event. Every moment of closeness was another stage of assimilation. She was being affectionate in the only language her creators gave her, and that language happened to be a biohazard. This is where Resident Evil 7 proved it could do something the franchise had never really attempted before: psychological horror and emotional complexity running simultaneously. Eveline isn't scary because she's powerful. She's scary because she's sincere. A monster that genuinely loves you is more disturbing than one that wants to kill you, because you can't hate it back without feeling like a monster yourself. And then Resident Evil 8 made it worse. Village retroactively revealed that Eveline's entire existence was downstream of Mother Miranda's experiments. Miranda had been searching for decades for a vessel to resurrect her dead daughter, and Eveline was essentially a failed prototype in that search. She wasn't just a weapon nobody wanted. She was a copy of a dead girl that didn't copy well enough. Her desire for a mother wasn't a glitch in her programming. It was the whole point of her design, and nobody cared when it actually worked. She spent her entire short life reaching out for human connection and receiving bullets in return. I don't know what to tell you, but if Eveline's tragedy is wanting a family she could never safely have, the real gut punch is what she did to the family that took her in. The Baker family. Every other monster on this list had some connection to the world that destroyed them. Scientists who worked for Umbrella, kids born into experiments, cult victims tangled up in decades of conspiracy. The Bakers had none of that, zero. They were a normal family living in rural Louisiana, minding their own business. And on June 8th, 2017, a little girl showed up at their door and ended everything. Jack was 55. Marguerite was 50. Lucas was 17. They had no ties to bioweapon research, no Umbrella history, no cult involvement. They were just people. And within 2 to 3 weeks of Eveline's mold infection taking hold, all three of them were unrecognizable. But here's what makes the Baker family different from every other tragic transformation in this franchise. They didn't all lose themselves the same way. Each one fell apart on a completely different axis, and that's what makes their story so devastating to actually sit with. Marguerite developed a secondary hive mind connection to the mold. Her individual agency basically evaporated. She wasn't fighting the infection because there wasn't enough of her left to fight. She became an extension of Eveline's will, a puppet with just enough of Marguerite's face left to make it hurt, which is, not ideal. Lucas is the complicated one. He retained full cognitive function throughout the entire infection. His mind stayed sharp, and he used that clarity not to resist, not to help his family, but to run his own sick experiments. The community is genuinely split on this kid. Some people argue he was a traumatized 17-year-old whose brain got rewired by rapid biological transformation, that the cruelty wasn't really him. Others point out that the infection gave him every tool to fight back, and he chose to build torture rooms instead. I don't know what to tell you. There might not be a clean answer on that one. And then there's Jack. Jack Baker is the emotional core of this entire story, and honestly, one of the most tragic figures in the entire franchise. Because Jack fought it. Multiple story branches in Resident Evil 7 reveal that he actively resisted full assimilation. He was aware of what was happening to him, he knew he was hurting people, he knew his family was gone, and he kept pushing back against the thing eating his mind. That's the Birkin parallel, except Jack never created anything. Jack never worked for anyone. Jack didn't inject himself in a moment of desperate ambition. He just opened his front door. A father who spent his final weeks trapped inside his own body, watching himself terrorize the people he loved, fighting a war he was always going to lose. The Bakers didn't deserve a single second of what happened to them. No hubris, no karma, no cosmic balancing of scales, just a family that got unlucky and paid for it with everything they had. dad. All three were killed during the mold purge in July 2017, less than 2 months from infection to death. That's how fast a normal life can become a horror story in this universe. But if you think a grieving father is tragic, wait until you meet the woman who spent over a century trying to bring her dead daughter back to life, Mother Miranda. Every tragic character on this list lost something: a daughter, a family, their own body. Mother Miranda lost one child, and then spent over a century destroying everything else trying to get her back. Here's the thing: Miranda wasn't some power-hungry cult leader from the start. She was a mother. A regular human woman living in an Eastern European village who watched her daughter Ava die during the Spanish flu around 1919. That's it. That's the origin story. No secret lab, no corporate espionage, no megalomaniacal ambitions. Just a woman who buried her child and couldn't accept it. And then she found the megamycete. Deep beneath her village sat a parasitic mold colony, ancient and impossibly powerful. And it offered Miranda something no grieving parent could refuse: a way to bring Eva back. The mold could store consciousness, transfer it between hosts, rewrite biology at a cellular level. All Miranda had to do was become its primary vessel, so she did. She bonded with the organism, became its host, and in doing so gained abilities that effectively made her immortal. Her lifespan stretched past 100 years. She could shapeshift, regenerate, control other infected organisms. She became, for all practical purposes, a god, but she didn't want to be a god. She wanted to be a mom. That's what makes Miranda genuinely horrifying. Every experiment she ran, every villager she infected, every life she ruined across multiple generations was in service of one goal: finding a genetically compatible vessel to house Ava's consciousness. She wasn't building an army. She wasn't conquering territory. She was auditioning children. For over a century, Miranda tested host after host, discarding failures like broken equipment. Entire bloodlines were consumed by her search. The four lords of the village, Dimitrescu, Heisenberg, Moreau, Donna Beneviento, were all failed experiments. People she infected and then deemed unsuitable, kept around as tools rather than acknowledged as the victims they were. And then Ethan Winters had a daughter named Rose. Miranda orchestrated the entire village plot: the kidnapping, the dismemberment of Rose into 4 separate flasks, the manipulation of every lord, all to reconstruct a vessel worthy of Eva's return. She didn't care how many people died. She'd stopped counting decades ago. When you've been mourning for over 100 years, individual human lives stop registering as anything other than variables in an equation you're desperate to solve. Here's where it gets complicated. Miranda is the dark mirror of every sympathetic parent on this list. William Birkin fought to protect Sherry even while mutating. Jack Baker resisted the mold to shield his family. Miranda did the opposite. Her love became so consuming, so absolute, that it devoured everyone around her. She proves that parental devotion without boundaries doesn't stay love. It becomes obsession. And obsession, given enough time and enough power, becomes monstrosity. The community remains genuinely split on her. Some players see a woman who deserved pity, corrupted by grief and an alien organism that exploited her pain. Others point out that she had over 100 years to stop, over 100 years to recognize that what she was doing had crossed every conceivable line, and she never did. Not once. She was killed by Ethan Winters in 2021, a father protecting his daughter from a mother trying to resurrect hers. The symmetry is almost too clean. But if you think Miranda's tragedy exists in isolation, wait until you meet the woman she turned into a 9-foot-tall vampire, because Alcina Dimitrescu didn't ask for any of this either. Lady Dimitrescu? Everyone remembers the memes. Everyone remembers the internet collectively losing its mind over a 9'6" vampire lady in a white dress. What most people don't remember, or never bothered to look into, is that Lady Dimitrescu might be the single most tragic character Resident Evil has ever produced. And I can prove it. Alcina Dimitrescu was a Romanian noblewoman in her mid-40s. Normal life, normal world, normal everything. Then around 1958, Mother Miranda infected her with parasitic mold, and everything about her changed. She grew to 9 feet 6 inches tall. She gained superhuman strength, an extended lifespan, and a body that was no longer entirely hers. She didn't volunteer for this. Miranda chose her, the same way Miranda chose everyone, as a means to an end. But here's where it gets genuinely heartbreaking. The infection took something from Dimitrescu that no amount of power could replace. She could never have children. Not naturally. Not ever. So instead, she became a mother to 3 bioengineered daughters, Bella, Cassandra, and Daniela, who were mold constructs. not human, not real. Pseudo-sentient organisms incapable of surviving outside the castle's controlled environment. They couldn't leave, they couldn't grow, they couldn't exist independently, and Dimitrescu loved them anyway. That's the part nobody talks about. She built an entire life around protecting daughters who were, on a biological level, elaborate puppets. She dressed them, named them, fought for them, mourned them when they died. Every maternal instinct she had was poured into something that could never truly reciprocate it. She was playing house with constructs, and she either didn't know or didn't care, because it was all she had. Think about what she actually possessed. Immortality, power, beauty, wealth, a castle, an entire legacy, and none of it mattered because the one thing she wanted, a real family, was the one thing the mold made impossible. She had everything and nothing at the same time, which is, not ideal. And the uncomfortable part? She wasn't entirely innocent. She was a complicit member of Miranda's cult. She fed on human blood, she terrorized the village. You can't hand-wave that away. But she was also serving the woman who forcibly transformed her, trapped in a hierarchy she didn't build, performing a role she didn't choose, victim and villain simultaneously, with no clean line between the two. That moral complexity is exactly what makes her the perfect final entry on this list, because she's the thesis statement for everything we've been talking about. Resident Evil's greatest trick has always been making you fall in love with the monster before quietly reminding you that the monster used to be a person. Lisa Trevor was a child who never stopped suffering. William Birkin was a father who destroyed himself trying to survive. The Bakers were a normal family eaten alive from the inside. Mother Miranda was a grieving parent who turned centuries of loss into centuries of cruelty, and Dimitrescu was a woman who wanted to be a mother so badly she accepted a lie and called it love. The franchise evolved from Lisa's silent, aimless suffering in a basement to Dimitrescu's operatic tragedy in a gothic castle. The monsters got bigger, louder, more elaborate, but the reason they hurt more now isn't the spectacle. It's that the humanity got deeper, the writing got braver, and somewhere along the way, Resident Evil stopped asking, what's the scariest thing that can chase you down a hallway, and started asking, what's the saddest thing that can happen to a person before they stop being one? Turns out, the answer is a lot. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.